The International Monetary Fund has dismissed the possibility of total debt cancellation for Nigeria, Ghana, and other African economies. Speaking during the African session at the ongoing IMF World Bank annual meetings in Marrakech, Morocco, IMF African Department Director Abebe Selassie said 50% of total debts in sub-Saharan countries are domestic, making debt forgiveness difficult. Selassie, who spoke on the theme in pursuit of stronger growth and resilience, said there is no super magic to waive and get rid of debts, adding that there should be country-specific dialogue on how to reschedule the debts. This morning, to talk more about this, we have Gospel Obele, Chief Economist at Streetnomics. He will be, of course, he's joining us from London, UK. Thank you so much, Gospel, once again for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me, Lekan. Good morning.
Now, as at 2019, over 90% of our global debt was concentrated in North America, Asia Pacific, and Europe. Meanwhile, regions like Africa, South America, and others accounted for less than 10%. Now, Africa owed around $1.313 billion as at then. Now, the total debt stock owed by Africa is over $1.8 trillion, way above the 100% mark. Now, there was the COVID-19, we understand, but was that the main reason for the astronomical rise in debt on the continent?
Yeah, thank you so much for the time. Yeah, we all know that, since COVID-19, there have been events in the world that has evolved, so you have the COVID-19 led, global recession. And then leading up onto the time, you also had that like the post-lockdown experience where companies were trying to come back to the fore, production institutions and all that. So lots of frictions, low global growth, and big questions around recovery. So in supporting and enabling recovery, more finances went into the space. The first reasons why, the amount of money in Africa countries or African as a nation, as a continent had access to was much higher because you needed to spend your way out of recovery of some sort. Now, all of these dynamics have also evolved with the Russian-Ukraine war and the fact that growth has been stifled over a period of time. And you now have a case of rebound and even recovery. So the global growth is almost plateauing at 2 to 3%. In many local economies, it's very hard to surpass 1 to 2% as well, even in Africa. And you understand how vulnerable African economies are. So with the advent of Russia-Ukraine war plus COVID-19, plus the fact that you have climate change dynamics, and now all these increasing moving parts are sort of fragmented global engagement. You have a situation where, rising amounts of monies have been made available to African nations in form of debt to also help their local economies thrive. But then again, this context is also within the realities of rising global inflation, rising interest rates, and unstable global monetary environment as well. So there are lots of moving, complicated parts, but the events that have transpired in a couple of years has reinforced the need for recovery and enable that rebound to recovery process, which a very large extent supporting spendthrift investment in developing economies in Africa.
No doubt $1.8 trillion is no small amount, I tell you, but then is it well within the financial capacity of these creditors to cancel this debt? Or if they do so, it probably might have grave consequences on their fiscal position?
It's actually a very tough one. And like the IMF rep in Africa mentioned, deglobalization led to what we term as fragmentations of nations in terms of individual nations or group of nations within geopolitical radar are now making tougher decisions, that are limiting and sort of even reordering how monies are being moved around, how investments are being moved around and all that. So I said that to say that it's going to be a lot more difficult to forgive debt this period because nations are in need of more liquidity, to get through the times we live in. There is increased cost of living. There is a there's a looming global recession ahead. More recently, we've seen the Israel attack and all of that. And even the Russian-Ukraine war is still happening in the midst of climate change and all that. So globally, more monies and more investments are needed to help the world navigate through the times we live in. And all of these realities are happening in the context of rising fragmentation. So it's going to be hard to forgive any national or regional debt in context. What we can have at the very, very, very best case scenario is probably to renegotiate the terms of payment, the pace of payment, and probably look for how you can work around it technically. Because another argument on the table is that even African nations need more monies to help their countries get out of the difficulties that we're in right now. But I don't see any cancellation of debt happening. The last major cancellation of debt that happened for Nigeria happened in 0304. And then the economic conditions enabling that was way easier, was much more stable than the times we live in. So with the fragmentations in view and more fragmentations as we go on, I do not think it's just going to be, it's going to come so easy to forgive debt, and it's also not going to speak well for the financials and the books of the creditor institutions as well.
We are going to continue with the discussion, Gospel, but then let's quickly watch this video excerpt of the director, of course, African Department, IMF, Abebe Selassie. I talked about the ruling out of debt forgiveness for African countries, and I'll get your reaction after this. Let's take a listen.
Magic wand that you can wave that will get rid of debt or solve these very, very difficult challenges that our countries face. So who's going to cancel the debt? The creditors, presumably, right? 50% of the debt in the region, in Sub-Saharan Africa, is, for example, domestic debt. How do you get rid of domestic debt? Okay. So I think we have to be really careful when we're talking about debt cancellations. Again, I think the principle has to be country by country. Okay. The creditor base in each country is now so complex than it has ever been, and debt sustainability also has to be assessed on a country by country basis, because the economic trajectories, the variables that impact their sustainability differ from country to country, and that's why we put so much store in the country specific dialogue. The position varies tremendously, and if and when the numbers suggest that there is a debt sustainability challenge, that's when you want to discuss debt restructuring issues, and that's when you enter, those kind of discussions. So I'm not sure there's a blanket debt cancellation solution out there. Hence, I think this country by country focus, going through the numbers and then trying to address it, I think is.
And there you have the director, African Department, IMF, Abebe Selassie, talking there about debt forgiveness. Now, Gospel, we just heard Selassie say that about 50% of total debt in sub-Saharan countries are domesticated or are domestic. So how do we, because he asked one question, he said, how do we get rid of domestic debts? Now, we've heard a couple of economists say that if the IMF and, of course, the creditors can come around and do away with or cancel external debt, it probably might just give these African countries a leeway to focus on domestic debt and be able to pay it off while also focusing on investing whatever it is they have in remnant into their economy. So how do we go around this, most especially for these African countries that are hugely indebted?
It's a very tough reality to start with, because we all know the narrative that got us to this position, and like I mentioned, we are now in a much more unforgiving space, not because of the word unforgiving, but because of the reality that creditors are also facing in the different markets. So also do not forget that with rising interest rates, it's a disincentive to also forgive debt. All right. So the creditor will get richer because you get to pay more in terms of on interest, and all that. So there is really no incentive to cancel the debt, and the logic, it's really valid. You cancel the debt, you have more time to focus on home debt and all that. But then again, it also shows to us that the time has passed where African leaders can just go negotiate what they want, and they just have that mercy from the international community and all that. We now need to begin to think of creative ways, to get past our own challenges. How do we deal with local debt when we don't have the leeway of being forgiven for foreign or external debt? So those are big conversations. So top of mind will be to have a very proper, clear, open conversations with the local creditors, and then begin to restructure, the terms of engagement, terms of payments. There are other incentives that the government in context can bring to the table to encourage or to facilitate the ease of those conversations with local creditors. All right. So the goal is now to begin to look inwards and critically ask ourselves, how do we facilitate these conversations going forward? How do we restructure our financing process? Interest rates are high. How do we negotiate these terms? How do we deal with the realities we are in again these times? I do not think anything positive or anything significantly positive that would change the status quo would happen from the external. It has to take on from the internal, and the governments have the power to draw up incentives that would help them in the negotiation room, as well as African governments, in my own opinion, have to be more responsible, because the reason why the debt commission is really a debt commission right now is because we're in pressing need of more monies in the local regions to develop and to help millions out of poverty, especially when the poverty caused by the cost of living cycle. So that technically means that we have not done well with past monies. All right. So if we had plugged in debt financing into sectors that yielded high-end returns 5-10 years ago, we'd be in a better position right now. And what that better position means that we may have higher debt, but we'll have a working local economy. All right. So you need to be able to trade your debt conversations with something. But right now you have money to trade off with, and the world is more deglobalized than ever before. So it's very tough positioning, but proper incentive-driven conversations in the negotiation room may go a long way to help gain relief.
Yes, talking about
creditors.
Of course, talking about governments being responsible, we have heard stories of how African governments have received these credit facilities and have expended them in ventures that have yielded next to nothing for them. And of course, there have been also allegations of corruption with governments of Ethiopia, Ghana, Malawi, Zambia. Of course, we know that Zambia has already defaulted in its debts. And some African countries are now in debt distress because of their inability to manage these funds that have been provided for them and to also invest these funds in critical sectors that could drive economic revival for them. So the question is, could this have been avoided? Before I move to the next question, could this have been avoided for these African countries?
Yes, 100% could have been avoided. But then again, the nature of what we've seen today is also a function to a very large extent of our ideologies as a people, as a nation, and the institutions that govern those ideologies. All right, we are not inclusive. We are not responsible spending kind of people. We don't prioritize the lives of people. We don't prioritize prosperity. We don't prioritize a working, productive, industrialized economy that works for all at the very basic functional level. We don't prioritize those things. All right. As a result, we build institutions that facilitate the extractive the extractive ideologies. All right, and that's what we've seen leading up until now. All of the debt is not a bad thing. In fact, the United States, the US, the UK have more larger debt portfolios than Nigeria and than Africa. But realize that they get easy concessions, they get easy negotiations, with most of these creditor institutions globally, because they have a very strong working economy that's contributing to global growth on many diverse grounds. All right, there are many areas where the negotiations can take on a win-win. But we don't have that in Africa, all right? We've not invested significantly in our local economies that can drive the necessary returns we need over time in the past with debt financing monies that we've got. And that has brought us to the position where we need more monies, but unfortunately nobody's willing or ready to borrow. So this could have been avoided.
And earlier on, of course, we listened to the IMF African Department Director Selassie suggesting that countries should we should have country-specific dialogue on how to reschedule the debt. So, which means that where there are conversation and talks, there should be a look into the peculiarities and the differences in these African countries, so that we can come to an understanding of how debt restructuring should come in and how it will help them pay off their debt. So for these highly indebted bonds, what peculiarities would you consider in order to aid in debt restructuring negotiations?
Well, I think I agree with that a lot, because I've always been of the opinion
that we've gone past the times where you have a one-size-fits-all approach, not just in development, but even in debt, in structuring, in financing, in governance, in policy development, in social interventions and all that. So the world is beginning to realize right now. And I think that the fragmented nature of the world right now has made us realize that, but it's getting late. However, that assertion just simply means that we now need to have more tailored approach to reviewing debt financing, debt commitments and all that with different nations. And what that would technically mean for us would be evaluating the economic landscape, the socio-economic landscape, the array of policies, in fact, even the political behavior, the undertone by the institutions locally, and asking ourselves, how viable can this particular nation or group of nations pay back this particular debt in XYZ period? Taking into cognizance now that we're in a more VUCA in quote environment, and how do you facilitate those local realities with ability to pay back, and what are the risks associated and how do we mitigate those risks? All right. So looking deeply into the local capabilities to repay are very, 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 top of mind ways we can use to begin to look at that personalized pathway to debt forgiveness or engagement in the future, if any. All right. So it's more around having a more personalized approach. However, I think I want to look at the sustainability of that from the local economy. All right. So take, for instance, in Nigeria, you have a thriving service sector. You have a thriving entrepreneurship space. You have many entrepreneurs who are ready to export, but are contained locally with the policies and institutions that we have self-developed. All right, so we've been self-destructive in many ways locally. So if you can begin to take out those veils, if you can begin to support lots of small businesses in the export streams, we can begin to organize the services sector, which is 56% of our GDP, but does not have a national policy. We don't have a national service policy. So if we can begin to look at these low-hanging fruits, then we can begin to do more for ourselves in terms of positioning of our strength or quote-unquote comparative advantage. Once we can begin to do that, once we can begin to do that, it technically means that we begin to position our economic profile and an economic realities for better negotiations in the debt rooms, with those creditors in the future. And that's the only way, all right? So if you're going more personalized, it will only mean that the receiving nation has to also improve, the outlook. And that would serve as the leverage to have the win-win conversations that are required. Because, if you go into the room without anything to offer, it's going to be a win-lose conversation, in terms of that personalized context. So the encouragement out there is to make Nigeria work, even if it's one sector that is thriving and significantly thriving. That can be the leverage point. And we have so many sectors that are thriving in spite of government. So the energy will just be to organize those markets and position correctly and take that as your leverage into the rooms where you're having those context conversations with the debt creditors globally, and then leverage that for future negotiations and all that. But right now we have nothing significantly to offer.
Let me also share with you another African narrative. Now, the IMF said it had loaned about $80 billion between 2020 and today to Sub-Saharan Africa economies for emergency funding and the special drawing rights allocations. Now, does it seem as though African countries are exploiting situations and privileges to actually access these funds, and maybe certain restrictions should be enforced?
So I think the current existing borrowing patterns are sort of more tailored into intervention-led, program-led, structure-led, finance, infrastructure need-led, and all of those things. There is a logic behind the fact that, yes, African nations may be exploiting some of these means to raise more financing, but again, even the financing that comes in are not being deployed into productive sectors for high returns. On the other side of things, you don't expect to want to raise money from these institutions and it won't come with conditions. All right. So if you look at it across board, it is not a win-win. All right. It is not a win-win because by virtue of going back to institutions to press in for more monies, you're having more conditions, being plugged into your economy, and that will not give you the breathing space to really do the development work or the prosperity work you need to, engage in to become self-reliant, significant in the future. So again, it boils down to African leaders. There is need for us to get our priorities right, rework our ideology and the institutions that govern those ideologies to ensure that debt monies or whatever monies are even available right now should be tailored to high-end productive investable causes. all right, that will position the local country or the continent at large, you know, that will position us for better negotiations on the debt table, all right? Because right now the outlook looks as though we are technically, you know, trying to make the most of opportunities that exist for our own personal satisfaction, as the case may be. So we need to do more outside, and we need to visibly do more to show that we are shifting the goalpost, and that will be the leverage to have conversations with these institutions. Otherwise, it's going to be constantly a win-lose.
All right, to drive this home, now, even as we conclude, we know that one of the things is actually choking the African economy has to do with the issue of inflation. And the World Bank Group President, RJ Banga, had at the annual meeting said interest rates will stay higher for longer periods. But then I'm just wondering, is that the only way central banks in Africa can tackle elevated inflation, most especially on the continent, because high interest rates are likely to complicate investments, and that could also slow down economic growth?
Yes, it's very worrisome, to be honest, and we aren't yet understanding what's going on. In 2007, up until 2008, I mean, economic variables generally will lead to economic recessions or economic challenges, as the case may be. But in 2019, leading up to 2020, we realized that even global health challenges can lead to global economic problems. You know, we saw how COVID-19 led to a global lockdown and all of that, and we are still yet to recover from that. That's technically to tell us that the times we live in, and with the complex fragmentations that comes with these times, requires us to think of the solutions to our problems almost differently. All right, safe enough as well that the construct of the inflation we are dealing with is not necessarily just a money supply issue. You have high commodity prices as a result of the Russian-Ukraine war, climate change, and COVID rebound/recovery issues and all of that. All right, so technically, using a monetary solution to solve an inflation that is not primarily structured monetary can also be a misalignment, you know, because in many regions, you've seen that the more we increase interest rate, looks as though, all right, the inflation, you know, still persists. For instance, in Nigeria. But unfortunately, we've heard the announcement by the World Bank president and the IMF chief that interest rates would consistently be on the rise. All right, so it's just unfortunate that the outlook for inflation may not really look very positive in context to interest rates. However, for local economies like Nigeria that have more vulnerability in context, we want to ask ourselves, how can we work in alignment in terms of the monetary and fiscal authorities to bring down inflation? And by doing that, you can relax the pressure and the pain of rising interest rates on the local economy. Okay. Because interest rates favor the financial market at the expense of the real economy. Okay. So if you look at it, our GDP hasn't gotten better with almost a year plus of constant increase in the rates and all of that. So there's a need to rethink how we're solving this problem.
Definitely, I tell you, because of course we see rising inflation, we see misguided monetary policies, of course we see dwindling revenue and weak economies as it characterizes Africa. And now that negotiations are ongoing with the creditors, it would just be meaningful and sensible for Africa to reposition and re-strategize with these people to see how they can at least restructure their debts and have a bit of buffer in their economies. Thank you so much, Gospel Obele, of course, Obele rather, Chief Economist, Streetnomics. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.